So thank you very much, and welcome to all of you to a FAIR webinar, A Path Forward, Protecting Students' Mental Health in a Divisive World. Just to briefly introduce you to the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to advancing the civil liberties of all Americans with work that is rooted in an acknowledgement of our common humanity and dignity. And as an organization, we pride ourselves on taking a positive path forward, closing our doors to no one, and advancing our mission in a genuinely nonpartisan way. We have over 70 chapters across 34 states. And if you're interested in getting involved in FAIR in any way, we encourage you to visit www.fairforall.org and get yourself familiar with the wonderful things that we're doing, from our chapters to our curriculum and learning standards, to our incredible profiles in courage, and so much more. So please visit and get yourself acquainted with us. And if you're intrigued more, sign up as a member and come join us in a genuinely pro-human mission. So tonight, we are here to talk about a very critical issue. I think all of us, anybody who's been attracted to FAIR, anybody who's coming to this webinar tonight, I think front and center, we care about the young people in our lives, and we care about children. And I think that everybody engaged in modern education does too. And the question is, are we helping these students and protecting these students in the right ways? In FAIR's observation, American K-12 schools are increasingly teaching what we consider to be divisive and regressive ideas to our children. Many parents, educators, and mental health experts are concerned about the negative impact on childhood mental health. With the academic year underway, our urgency to be informed is critical to protect our children, to keep them learning and thriving. This topic raises many important questions. How does an ideology that fixates on immutable traits contribute to childhood anxiety and depression? How is psychology used by illiberal elements of this orthodoxy to gain influence? What is the psychological impact of shaming and silencing speech? How can parents talk with their children about these issues? How do parents advocate with teachers and administrators for more compassionate approaches to these issues that build off the strength of our common humanity? We hope to have a broad-ranging conversation that addresses many of these questions tonight. And we absolutely are going to leave time for questions and answers from you all. You'll notice a Q&A function on the bottom bar there. So feel free to populate that questions and with questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. But I'd like to get to the heart of the matter here and introduce our panelists. We're trying to approach this issue from a number of different vantage points. And so we've assembled a crew here tonight that we think can give us a lot of different angles on these interrelated issues. First, we have a current student, a senior at Brooklyn Tech in New York, Daniel Idfresne, who, if you do not know Daniel, he has published a fabulous essay on the roots of his own heterodox thinking, his open-mindedness, and the development of his own empowerment and sense of agency. And this can be found on Barry Weiss's Substack, I think, among other places. We're very, very honored to have Daniel with us here tonight to give us a perspective on these issues from within school, from the very population of students that we're most concerned about. We also have a recent college graduate, Gavin Coon, joining us tonight. Gavin recently graduated from Kenyon College and is now working for FAIR in a broad support capacity. We also have two FAIR members and former educators, Paul Rossi from New York and Dana Stangel-Plowe from New Jersey, who can bring in their firsthand experience with the culture of schools. We also have on our panel Erica Komisar, licensed clinical social worker, psychoanalyst, parent coach, and author, who actually has a book coming out very soon on October 19th called Chicken Little, The Sky Isn't Falling, Raising Resilient Adolescents in the New Age of Anxiety, which is certifiably one of the greatest colon titles that I've heard in some time. So thank you, Erica, for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Carrie Mendoza. Dr. Mendoza has over 20 years of experience in emergency medicine, working on the front lines of the healthcare safety net and treating everything from trauma to COVID to mental health. So we're very thrilled to have this range of vantage points and voices on our panel tonight. And we're just going to take, before we jump into our discussion, we're going to just hear from each of these panelists just for a minute or two about sort of why they find themselves here, why they're interested in this topic of mental health in this new culture that we're seeing in schools. So we'll start here with Dr. Komisar.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I mean, resilience is the topic that I really talk about. So what brought me to this is the mental health aspect and how to foster healthy psyches in schools. Resilience isn't something we're born with. It's something that actually can't be taught in school. It comes from a foundation of emotional security. It comes from home. From critical and primary attachment figures at home. However, there are things that schools can do to either amp up or reduce the amount of stress that kids are experiencing. There are two critical windows of development, right brain development, 0 to 3 and 9 to 25. And when the environment, and at those two critical points, the environment is very important in terms of either fostering a sense of emotional security and reducing the amount of stress, or, as I said, amping it up. And so, I'm here really because we really have to think. I mean, I'm a therapist, but as educators, I encourage educators to think about what they can do to reduce the stress to children. And some of those things, I'll just list a few that I think about. Are thinking about the pressure we put on these kids academically. We put a tremendous amount of pressure on kids to achieve at a very high level. We focus on left brain development rather than right brain development, which is social emotional development. And we emphasize getting into a good college, no matter what kind of school the kids are in. We talk about getting into the best college, as opposed to thinking about education in terms of a child's strengths and what's right for them. In addition, I got involved with this when I was asked because it's very concerning and contributing to the stress of adolescence in particular, that we are teaching children what to think rather than how to think. It's important to give them tools to express their curiosity and question what they're learning. But if through our current cancel culture and the authoritative manner in which we are teaching identity, it is disempowering our children to ask tough questions and express disparate views, are we really giving them the confidence as thinkers, learners, and leaders? Part of mental health is accepting and feeling accepted for your own unique and individual identity and opinions.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Next up, why don't we hear from Daniel Idfresne?
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Brian. It's an honor to be here. My name is Daniel Idfresne. I'm 17 years old and I go to Brooklyn Technical High School, one of the 8 specialized high schools in New York City. As Brian said, I recently wrote a piece on Barry Weiss's Substack, Common Sense with Barry Weiss, and it is called I Am 17 and Immunized from Woke Politics. It got reprinted on the New York Post as well. And so if you would like to give that a read, you can go over to the New York Post or Barry Weiss's Substack and you can go check it out. In the days after I published that piece, I've had many students come up to me, and what I saw in their eyes was a sense of relief that they are not alone. And it really speaks to what kind of culture we are in today and what students have to deal with. It seems like there is something that is keeping them from exploring the world as they should. when I'm in classes, before they, I would say, talk about ideas which they do not necessarily agree with, there's always a disclaimer of some sort. Well, I don't agree with these ideas, or I'm just saying this because it could be an answer, as if they are protecting themselves from something. And we know that something is a culture that does not forgive. And it is very important for students my age to have forgiveness, or to be able to forgive other students for maybe saying maybe something that is disrespectful or whatnot, but for them to be able to know that when they explore the world, whether it is intellectually or whatnot, that they can receive forgiveness when they make mistakes of their own. And so when I wrote that piece, and I went to school for the first week of school, it was fascinating to see the students, very smart students, by the way. All right, we're talking about a very smart school, or a rigorous school with very smart students, and even they are not, I would say, impervious to what is going on right now. And so I'm very, very happy to be here today to talk about the mental health of students. Uh, Again, if you would like to read my piece on the New York Post or on Barry Weiss's Substack, you can go check it out. It is called I'm 17 and I'm immunized from woke politics.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much for coming. And let's turn next to Gavin Coon.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gavin Coon. I graduated from college, Kenyon College, if anybody knows it, last year. So kind of seen a little bit, and definitely in high school and college, kind of how things are progressing. So I was kind of seeing it from the start a little bit. Yeah, what made me, a lot of things made me want to join FAIR and sort of get involved in this stuff. But yeah, just seeing what it did to my friends. I mean, I saw so many people who used to be like very curious people become kind of like a shell of themselves, and it made me really sad. I saw a lot of kids who maybe formerly cared about talking about issues. They sort of just became people who only really cared about seeming as if they cared, and that really upset me. And it strained relationships too. I saw it all the time at college, and after reading writers like Jonathan Haidt, I saw a lot about how this stuff really dovetailed with tech and how that sort of rise of tech gave way to this. And I sort of saw how tech facilitated this feeling as if like your mistakes live forever, and you have to protect yourself, and it's like every man for himself, and it just separates the world into like good people and bad people, which is just, it's part of growing up, I think, to realize that you grow up and realize that people are very complicated and that you can't sort of apply that lens to everything. So yeah, that's pretty much what I got, and I'd like to pass it off to the next panel.
Thank you, Gavin. Let's go next to Dana Stangel-Plowe.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Dana. I am here to offer a teacher's perspective. I taught for 7 years at an independent school in New Jersey, although I live in New York. So I consider myself a New Yorker. But I didn't start my career as a teacher. I actually started as an attorney. I practiced for a few years and went back to my first love, which was poetry. Found myself as a teaching artist, directing children and children's Shakespeare theater, like full-scale productions with children. And it was during that process that I realized it wasn't just poetry and Shakespeare that I loved, but I loved teaching. I loved that moment of watching kids understand something, sort of the light bulb moment, some people call it, where you suddenly see somebody understand something for the first time, and it's incredibly empowering for the kid, and incredibly gratifying as a teacher to be there guiding a student towards that moment. So ultimately, I became an English teacher at a private school, K through 12 school in New Jersey. And I walked around for 5 years saying that I had the best job in the world, which I did at the time. Now I have the best job in the world. I've since left there. But I saw the school undergo some serious changes very slowly, and then all of a sudden very quickly. And I was concerned. I raised the flag many times while I was at school with unfortunately very pretty much no effect at all in the school. But what I could see in the kids, I saw the change in the kids. I saw what I found to be sort of an eggshell culture, kind of as we've been listening to and hearing described, an eggshell culture where kids were either afraid to speak or even afraid to ask questions. And I thought that fear of asking questions had ramifications in terms of their own development, academically, of course, but also emotionally and socially. And I started to see kids who were experiencing, a kind of isolation from each other. And ultimately, that's what brought me to FAIR. I resigned last spring, and I'm working full time now with FAIR in various ways. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Let's go next to Dr. Carrie Mendoza.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm Carrie Mendoza. I'm in the Chicago suburbs. I'm an emergency medicine physician. I'm also a mom of 3 teenage boys, and I became aware of FAIR through Megyn Kelly's podcast and then reading Bayon's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about starting FAIR. And it really resonated with me because I was seeing changes at my kids' school where this sort of obsessive focus on race was really taking over the school, where math and science classes would be focusing on, race instead of actually teaching the topic. I think also, being in Chicago for most of my life, seeing sort of this dichotomy between what is actually going on in our city in low-income areas versus what they were talking about in the school was, really distressing. And sort of the lack of ability to have feedback with the administration and teachers. So that was a big concern. And then in my professional life as an emergency medicine physician, I'm really exposed to the social safety net and how social policies, have unintended consequences, as well as, drug and alcohol problems, throughout people's lives, and seeing more of that going on with kids. And I trained in Colorado and arrived after Columbine, but a lot of the attendings that trained me did take care of Columbine victims and were really affected by that. And having children grow up in that environment, the school culture was very focused on, school safety issues. And so now being back in Chicago and kind of seeing all these changes and this focus that's really quite divisive, I was very concerned about how that's affecting school culture, and want to always do everything to try and minimize any harm to anyone, but especially kids. And so I do volunteer for FAIR, helping in Illinois with the sort of general chapters, as well as FAIR in Medicine, where we are trying to host webinars like this and look into all these issues so we can, help kids thrive as well as everyone else. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. Let's turn finally to Paul Rossi.
Hi, everyone. I, as a teacher at a private school in Manhattan until very recently, my experience is very similar to Dana's. I began to notice an increasing obsession within the school around certain types of ways of framing identity in ways that had consequences, I think, for the students' intellectual development and the atmosphere within the school, and the way that I was noticing, affecting different students in different ways. And when I challenged that in a segregated Zoom meeting, it ultimately led to a series of consequences in my dismissal from the school. Why I'm here tonight is because I think this is a great opportunity to really explore with medical and licensed professionals about do a deep dive into what's happening with with students that are subjected to the kind of identity work that's going on within the schools, and what are the assumptions of that type of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anti-racist work, as it's called, and what are the mechanisms in place that are really the structural mechanisms that are really behind a lot of it as well. So I'd like to try to, maybe offer that to the conversation.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for doing this tonight, and really looking forward to our conversation. So we'll get things started, and what we have is a series of prompts, and we'll just see where these go. There's no sort of fixed process that we have to use here, but I'm going to start with a pretty broad question. I think it's certainly true. I can't speak for every teenager, but having been one, I think it's hard enough just to be 16, just to be a teenager, and show up at school with no other variables in play. And yet now we see an environment that in so many ways is a minefield, and often a stifling place filled with confusing mixed messages, and diktats coming from administrators and teachers, and a sort of forced atmosphere often. Many of you alluded to that in your opening statements. So I just want to put this out there. The prompt, I would say, is what is concerning you most about the current trends that you're seeing in schools today? What is concerning you most? So I think, why don't we start with Erica Komisar, and then we can just see where this goes.
Well, I mean, I think the idea is that we're supposed to be promoting education and creating open-minded individuals who are open to all kinds of ideas, and ideas you might not agree with. I mean, we're not in school just for agreement. We're in school to learn to think, as I said in my opening statement, and to be open to really hearing other people's opinions. I mean, we learn from other people's opinions, even if we don't like them. And so I think this kind of silencing of other opinions that are outside of what is now considered the norm is not healthy for children, right? If we're trying to promote the idea of expressiveness, right? We know that for mental health, I'm going to always bring it back to mental health because that's my perspective. From the perspective of mental health, being able to express your thoughts and your feelings openly and not feeling restricted is much healthier for children than the environment that we're creating.
And in terms of, go ahead.
Sorry, Brian. Okay, I was going to answer. I guess I find in terms of kids these days, it's getting to the point where you can have a conversation with someone. Let's say there's a recent person in the news who's been canceled, and you talk to someone about it, and they might think that wasn't right that that person got canceled, but they kind of don't care. And it's getting to the point where it's almost like, I liken it to like you go to a restaurant and you have a bad meal there, even though you love the restaurant, and going back or something that like, it would be totally fine. Like that was just one time, but there's something in people's brains these days that's just like instinctual. Like they don't even want to think about like what could be, they just want to like have a reflex. And I don't think that makes good adults, because then you have a bunch of people who aren't really thinking through their actions. They're just doing something based on reflex. And I think that's leading to a lot of kids these days feeling aimless too, because they're just no delayed gratification, just like wanting to do something, because they want to do it,
Yeah, that's actually, Gavin, that's actually something that I've been thinking about as well. The idea that if your identity is handed to you, or the answer to what the book means is handed to you, or who the bad guy is and who the good guy is handed to you, you never have the chance to practice figuring those things out for yourself. And so you're more likely to expect things to kind of fall into binaries, or to not care, because the binaries don't really hold. There's a lack of nuance, I think, is what you're talking about, and how people see the world. And I saw that a lot in the classroom. The kids looking for a particular answer. Of course, students always want to please the teacher. When they find out that I don't want to be pleased, when I want to play devil's advocate, they're always like like a big sigh of relief, like, okay, so we can explore different ideas here. I think that's what's missing, and that is what's concerning me, because it's the practice of thinking, the practice of asking questions. If you don't have that practice, you won't know how to do it as an adult. And then,
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
I
is
want-
definitely true. I would say in my experience being in a classroom, there is a sort of hesitancy to when students know that you are going to go down a certain route that is not necessarily what the orthodoxy believes, then there's an extreme amount of hesitancy when answering the question. And when they eventually do answer the question, you know, that the answer is burdened with a lot of trying to disassociate themselves from the answer that they're giving. And you know, I think that is because, well, two things. First thing is when the answers that you give, or you know, your beliefs, whether your political beliefs or maybe it's religious or whatnot, when that is now part of, or your physical, like it is part of your physical being, and when you also make certain beliefs inherently evil, or I would say taboo to talk about, then your existence is taboo because you believe in those things. And so even if it's just exploring certain ideas, the just the idea of uh just saying that whatever belief or contention that a student may make is in itself, I would say, a sin, and that's why there's a hesitancy to explore different ideas in the classroom.
Yeah, I definitely see what Daniel's talking about is that, I mean, someone told me recently that certainty is the antithesis of curiosity. So when you have these kind of plug and play moral imperatives, students also have, a conscience that wants to explore and be curious about, but there's definitely this alienation that I noticed from the situation where, you can't actually own your thought. If you're going to play the devil's advocate, you have to say, hey, I'm not the devil. Someone may say this, and I remember leading a class on persuasion and having a student say, we're talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, and a student mentioned the riots, and 3 students jumped on top and were like, protest, you mean protest? And he said, yeah, protest. So the truth is that there were protests and riots. So why can't we sort of broaden the spectrum of what we're introducing and talk about the full palette of human experience, rather than sort of having these sort of moral impositions? I think that really does cheapen the discourse for the students.
There's a measure of peer pressure too, right? I mean, what you're describing. I mean, when I can remember times in class where everybody agreed on what something meant. Everybody agreed. Nobody was willing to challenge. And I would say, does anybody want to try to maybe offer a different view? Total silence. And I would say, okay, well, somebody hypothetically, if there were a different view, then what would that person say? And then, very little by little, they would maybe, because it was hypothetical. But I think it is in large part a consequence of peer pressure and not wanting, they're teenagers and not wanting to be different.
I want to pick up on, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I definitely agree. I would say that peer pressure is definitely something that teens specifically have to deal with, just because for teenagers, social circles are essentially I would say, a very important part of a teenager's social life. They care about what their friends think, and that their opinions is usually displayed, or it is displayed on social media, right? And so how do you get or how would you get acceptance from your friends? Well, get a certain amount of likes make sure everybody in your class likes your photos or and whatnot. And so what you get in social media, at least from what I've seen, is there's sort of there are ground rules that a profile has to meet. You know, you have to have the pronouns in your bio. You have to have the you know, your home address to various social justice causes. So last year, was it last year? I believe it was last year during the protest riots, whatever you may believe. The common thing that you will see on every single profile was BLM, you know, with the fist or Black Heart or whatever, and then, you know, a link to donate. And it was eerie seeing that, you know, seeing every single account follow that same sort of order. It was in the same exact order, and it was just interesting to see. And I asked a few of my friends, hey, you know, have you seen this? You know, have you seen this? And a lot of my friends are at least the friends who I know, you know, critically think, or I would say all of my friends critically think, they just won't do it in a public setting. They'll say, yeah, you know, I have noticed that. That is weird, you know. The fact that, you know, it wasn't like a teacher. You know how teachers, you know, they would say, you know, put in your name, then the teacher's name, then the subject, and then the date. It was sort of like that, but there was no like, oh, it was almost culturally enforced in a sense, or socially enforced. And, you know, that's the result. When acceptance is the highest value, then you put in your bio in a certain manner, which you would think, oh, like I would say, you would think that, oh, I am, you know, doing the right thing. But when you take a step back and you look at all the accounts, it's, whoa, like you guys are moving in lockstep, and it's weird, you know. So I just wanted to note that, the social media side as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that, you know, I see, you know, increased depression, anxiety visits for that in the emergency department. And, you know, I think that this definitely contributes where there's this very rigid environment that's developed in the schools where, you know, kids can't really ask questions or, you know, they're concerned that who they are, you know, just isn't allowed. And so, you know, I see those, it's complicated, but I see those effects where, you know, maybe that's turning in on themselves as depression. And then, you know, I worry about in this environment where they're, the schools are supposed to be places of growth and exploring, are kind of saying, hey, you know, this group is bad and you know, this group is good, and how, you know, a teenager who's trying to figure out who they are, how they internalize that. And I worry about them, you know, turning that in on themselves or turning that on their own communities if they're being told that, you know, all white people are bad, or, you know, you should feel bad about where you grow up. And so that, you know, I'm just very concerned about that, and see that manifest in more kids coming into the emergency department depressed or using drugs. So
I want to pick up on something Dana said about the binary nature of thinking, because basically developmentally, adolescents are supposed to be moving away from binary thinking. And what's happening is they're trapped in it, because the paradigm that they're trapped in school is it's a binary kind of thinking. You're good, you're bad, you're right, you're wrong. And as Dana said, there's no nuance, but also from a perspective, not just a cognitive perspective, which is nuance is supposed to be something they're moving toward and away from that binary cognitive development. And I think Paul also talked about the moral aspects, which is, you know, there's even a nuance to the moral aspects, meaning, you know, adolescents enter, you know, this period of development because of the brain development at the time. They enter with a very harsh and self-critical kind of a sense of themselves in the world, a very self-conscious. There's a lot of self-consciousness and self-criticism and harshness. meaning they go into adolescence with a very intense superego-ish kind of way of thinking about the world and themselves. It's up to us as parents, as educators, as adults around them, coaches and mentors, to soften that binary thinking, whether it's cognitively or morally or about themselves, right? The idea of softening the harshness of their superegos. What's happening is that it's being sharpened. So in other words, and that's, as Carrie said, that's sort of what may be contributing to the breakdown of some of these kids, is that at a time when they're already very self-critical and self-conscious, instead of softening, it's being sharpened.
I'd like to dig in on this bit a little bit more too, the mental health aspect of what you're talking about. And it seems that, in many ways, schools are more than ever drawing attention to mental health issues. I know when I was teaching, we had Mental Health Awareness Month, and there seems to be more knowledge of and more attention to understanding and bringing out of the shadows those who are grappling with these kinds of issues. So there's that on one hand, and then you also have this formative issue of adolescence. As we all know, the understanding of adolescence has changed over the years, and now, of course, what's considered a formative period is extending further into one's 20s. I'm no expert on that, but I know that the understanding of that has changed, and I wonder what the long-term effect on mental health is of, Daniel described students who, and Gavin did too, who might otherwise have been very critical, very interested, not introverted, not shy, but now they're deciding to be silent because of the rigidity of the atmosphere. What is the long-term effect on mental health of that kind of environment where identity is being simplified, this binary kind of thinking is being emphasized? What is the long-term effect, especially in these, with it happening earlier and earlier in the formative years? What is the effect on the reflexes of students, the intellectual reflexes of students, and the long-term mental health?
I mean, you could say that the healthiest ego is a flexible ego. So resilience is about flexibility. And so what's being promoted at a time when we need to be promoting flexibility. So when they leave high school and go into college, they can be resilient. They can deal with adversity. They can deal with stress. And what it's doing is it's promoting, the word that we keep hearing over and over again tonight is inflexibility and rigidity. And I always use the analogy when I'm speaking publicly, about, you have a hard piece of wood, a tree made of hardwood. And when the storm comes, that tree, the branches break, or maybe the tree falls over. But if you have a tree of softwood that is flexible and blows in the wind, then when the storm and adversity comes, it doesn't blow down. So we are creating very inflexible, very fragile kids.
I think it.
Yeah,
I think it
agree.
also. Oh, sorry, Daniel.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I was also gonna say to Erica's point and to Paul and Dana's point, I think the way we're teaching kids, it puts them like out of touch with themselves. Like, I remember I was not in this class in high school, but I remember a friend of mine reporting this situation, and he was coming to me and he was like, we had this class about Huckleberry Finn, and we were talking about and it's a hard subject, but they were talking about, were slave masters evil? And it was an interesting question because they were sort of trying to ask, like, of course, the effect of what they did was undoubtedly evil. But like, if you're a person growing up in that society and those are your values, what's to say what evilness is when it's constantly being put on you? And I remember my friend was like, isn't that so ridiculous that people were asking this question? I couldn't say it at the time, but I remember thinking like, no, I think those kids were trying to do the thing that you want them to do. They were trying to get in touch with maybe who they could have been if they were in that situation. And that allows you to see the evilness in front of everybody constantly and avoid it. If you know it that well, then you can get out of the way of it better than someone who just wants to put blinders on and not look at it. So, you know, when I saw that situation, I was like, you're just, I mean, in my opinion, maybe someone else could disagree with me. I think that's a really interesting conversation. But to me, it's like, that's part of being human, is being able to see how you could have been a fundamentally different person in another situation. And when you don't see that, then you don't see yourself. Like, you failed to see, in my opinion, just how humans work. And so, you know, I remember, and to Dana and Paul's point, I think, you know, I was, you know, sort of talking with a therapist recently. They told me that they don't give advice to patients. And maybe Carrie and Erica could speak on sort of that type of stuff. And I was asking them why, and they were like, because then if you tell someone what to think, they're not really gonna actually feel as if they benefit from the advice. They're gonna sort of just keep doing, they're gonna feel as if it was like imposed on them. Whereas you want to guide them toward seeing something within themselves. And I think it's just a similar feeling of like, you need to give kids the tools, but let them see the growth themselves, you know? And if they don't have that, then it's like, I think it's just, things collapse a little bit.
Yeah, what Gavin talked about was very interesting, and we definitely should zero in on that a bit more as we go in more, you know, as we talk more on this issue. But I really wanted to go back to this idea of like flexibility that Erica was talking about. I really liked it because, you know, when I think about what this orthodoxy is doing, it is stopping students from embodying the hero archetype. And what is that hero archetype? That is gaining values. When you're a hero has to go through that. I would say they need to gain values. Maybe it's from a parent, or when it was Spider-Man, you know, you have your Uncle Ben's and whatnot, and stuff like that. Every student, every person is the hero of their story, and they have maybe a supporting character who gives them very important lessons that they carry on, that they take and they use to defeat whatever villain that they may end up facing in the future. And when you're flexible, you're able to look at all the advice, all the values, all the different points of view, and say, hey, maybe I don't know what this means right now, but maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, maybe I might remember, hey, Erica told me this back when I was younger. Now that I'm in a certain situation, I truly understand what she means. But when you're too rigid, and this is what's happening right now, so if certain values are already deemed evil right from the get-go, you shouldn't even listen to them, discard them, they're evil, don't listen to them, then you are stopping students from getting all the values that they should be taking in right now, right? This is the most important, these years that especially teenagers have. They're very important years. Their parents are telling them, or teaching them, or like the teachings of their parents from when they're younger are starting to be put on display, especially as you get into college and you're operating on time, not on a school's time where you walk in at 8 a.m. and leave at whatever time the school ends, but you're really working yourself. You have a lot of independent time. And so this sort of orthodoxy stops students, all students, from embodying the hero archetype. And then and we get into like intersectionality here, depending on the race or the gender of the student, is even worse for them. So maybe as a Black student, you're being stopped from embodying the hero archetype because white words are a form of white supremacy, and so your white teacher can't give you the advice that they've learned from before. But it's way worse for maybe a white student, a white male student, who now, because they are burdened with the charge of benefiting from this this blob that is inherently evil, whether it be racism or sexism. They are unable to, I would say, first, they are unable to redeem themselves, and second, they're unable to talk to their Black counterparts and female counterparts and whatnot. And so what intersectionality does is make it worse dependent on the student.
I just have to add very quickly. Oh, that Gavin and Daniel, you clearly both had very good English teachers. The hero's journey, Huckleberry Finn, you guys are like making my night. I will add that the rigidity that you're talking about, Daniel, I think it's really important, and the flexibility, Erica, the idea of intellectual humility is something that we don't see much in adolescents generally, or even adults, right? But the idea that it's okay to be wrong, and that it's good to be wrong because you can learn from being wrong, that is totally discouraged when you're handed a preset, a sort of a prepackaged versions of principles based on a worldview that you may or may not agree with. And so that concept of intellectual humility and intellectual honesty is one that I wish, that I hope comes back to classrooms to help with growth and development.
Yeah, you reminded me of something. Sorry, I just wanted to say about the sort of brittleness of an ambiguity intolerance, which is sort of in a feedback loop with anxiety. So I think that the more anxious students are, then the more they are going to grasp at rigid categorical ways of good and evil, and then that will actually create more anxiety around needing to belong or be seen as good. What do you, I'd be interested to see what Carrie and Erica think of that.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that I mean, obviously flexibility and it is important, but I just wanted to add, keep it in the frame where being so flexible, where you are kind of denying who you are, or this concept we haven't gotten into yet of just the safetyism culture, where if something, someone says something to me, they're telling me I'm going to crumble, or the person next to me might crumble if I say the wrong thing, and then I'm going to harm them. And I see that the ripples of that also in the mental health issues in the emergency department, where it's like the ability to cope. It's almost like some kids are told, like, you're not going to be able to cope, and everything is really bad, and you might need a pill for that, or kind of getting into over pathologizing a lot of things, just maybe even just some of the regular discomfort we all had to go through as teenagers, and we did get through it. So I feel like there's that balance between obviously being flexible, being free thinking, but also knowing that you are strong, teaching the kids they are strong enough to get through things, and that if your feelings are hurt or someone rejects your idea, the world, you're not going to fall apart at the seams. So I think there's that balance there, and it just seems to be that the schools are not promoting a balance. It seems either one way or the other, and the sort of middle ground seems to have been lost. But I'm curious what Erica might think about that.
Well, I don't think it's just related to intellectual thought. I think it's related to, I don't mean to redirect this conversation down a different path, but I'm imagining it's going down this path anyway. Ethnocultural identity is a very big part of growing up, meaning where do you get that from? You get that, again, you don't get resilience from from school, you get it from home. You also get your ethnocultural identity from home, not from school. But the fact that schools are making children declare in a very rigid way who they are, how they identify, again, another way in which it's brittle, because most teenagers don't even have a sense of who they are yet, or depending on where they fall in adolescence, who they are, where they're from, how they identify. They may identify as many different things, not one thing. So across the board, it's not just, it's intellectual rigidity, it's identity rigidity. There's a lot of rigidity, and I think it concerns me, right? Because again, adolescents are so fragile anyway. They're fragile because they come into school already developmentally with a certain kind of rigidity, and educators as well as parents are supposed to be softening that rigidity. And in fact, the educators are doing just the opposite. The teachers are increasing the harshness and increasing the rigidity. So just the opposite. So then they do go into adulthood, and what Carrie is seeing, I'm sure you see a lot of college kids too. They go into young adulthood really unprepared, you know, for life, for adversity.
So we have identified a number of major concerns, from inflexibility and rigidity in the classroom to, you know, Gavin's line hit me powerfully about kids being out of touch with themselves, struggling to, and we know that schools are putting students between a rock and a hard place, asking them simultaneously to take risks, to lean into discomfort, to and also then to tread impossibly on eggshell floors, and be rigid. And we've identified here tonight a number of these things that concern us, but I'd be remiss if I did not come back to our panel discussion title, A Path Forward. So I thought we could pivot for a moment and talk a little bit about maybe some constructive approaches and a path forward from this. And I've noted that in a Q&A, there are a number of questions about this very thing, right? What do we do? So, you know, whether it's the question of a unique personal identity, that journey, or this term resilience that shows up so often, you know, how do we cultivate resilience in young people, and how do we create an atmosphere that allows them to develop a healthy, personal, unique identity on their own terms? I'd love to talk about that and get your thoughts on it. How do we, what is the path forward there?
Well, I would say this. I really liked what Erica said about, you know, your ethnocultural identity coming from home. You know, moral education, and my parents are a huge proponent of this. Moral education happens at home, and so the first thing I would say is parents need to be more involved in their students' lives. You know, I would say that a lot of the students who don't believe in what's going on right now are children of immigrants, and I ask myself all the time, why is this? And the reason why is because those children of immigrants have seen their parents work hard and become something in the United States, and so that, just seeing their parents go at it and work and reap those benefits, that alone has, I would say, inculcated a sort of inculcated a value of hard work, of responsibility, and I would say that children of immigrant parents are way more, I would say, authoritative with their moral teachings. You know, I would, at least I could say from my parents. My parents are very, very, they're religious, they're devout, and so, you know, I probably wouldn't go a day without having my mom remind me to read a psalm, or to pray before I go to sleep, or to you know, to make sure that you remind yourself that, make sure I remind myself that God will be with me during the day. And you know, whether your parents are inculcating, or parents are inculcating those values through a religious lens or not, that needs to happen, because teachers can barely get through a lesson in 40 minutes. There's no way they'll be able to help your students form a complex moral worldview in that time as well. And so I would say, you know, and it's hard, you know, parents, where they're working all the time. You know, when you get home, all you have time to do is to cook for your children, and maybe ask them how, you know, school was at the dinner table. But, you know, being in your child's life and making sure they understand what their ethnocultural identity is, make sure they understand what your moral code is crucial for a child's development.
I'd like to add, that was terrific, Daniel. I'd like to add that what I think is going on is that the identity has replaced the self. This idea of a socially imposed identity, is really become a kind of an ersatz false self for a lot of adults and students both. And so resiliency, as in my experience, which is kind of a dirty word, unfortunately, and among a lot of DAI practitioners now, it really comes from a self which is like Eric was saying, is adaptable. It comes from a sense within that you can transcend the immediate slings and arrows of your environment. It's not an accident that I've noticed that students that have a religious or strong family unit backing them up tend to have a stronger sense of identity and integrity and sort of cohesion of a self. And it's a pattern that I've noticed. I think I think those students tend to be more resistant to glomming on to or really conforming to certain group ideas.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that the idea of an identity being handed to you, right? Being told that you're a member of a group, and how to get like teenagers to avoid that. I guess I would love to be able to suggest ways to appeal to the rebel in all the teenagers. So in other words, I'm not XYZ, I'm ABC. Who are you to tell me? And there seems to be a sort of a dampening of that among the teenagers that I've dealt with, that I've seen. And so part of what I like to think of as maybe being helpful would be encouraging kids to find role models. There are very few role models, if you look around in media, but role models who do their own thing, who think for themselves, who maybe question an orthodoxy, or think maybe who think differently. I sometimes would put up in my classroom, I'm a child of the 1980s, so question authority was a big bumper sticker in the 1980s. So just, I'd like to put question authority in my classroom, and then underneath it, I would write question everything. And they would say, even you? And I'd say, yes, even me. The idea to role model questioning. And that's advice that I would give to parents, and that I would pass on.
So I'm going to just add to what Dana said. I don't think authority means what it used to mean. Authority was your teacher. Now it's social authority. Now it's sort of the group mentality about, so, like questioning authority would be, not doing what your teacher said or not doing what your parents said. Now it's like a bigger moral authority. And one thing I'm noticing in my practice, I can tell you, is there's a movement for heterosexual kids to call themselves queer. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon, because if they truly are queer, then of course they should call themselves queer. But there is a movement to call yourself queer because if you call yourself heterosexual, you're judged because you're not on the spectrum. You're not fluid. I think that's really interesting. So the authority is no longer just the adults. And I mean, the adults are also, there are some teachers who I think are acting as authorities in this case, but there's a sort of social authority that kids are coming up against.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's very well put. I'm glad you put that point on it. Thank you, Erica.
Yeah, and maybe think about it. Do you think that we're moving from towards more of a shame culture because of that?
Yes.
That because of the social, instead of looking within to your own set of values, we're looking outwards?
I would say a shame culture is the correct term. A culture of shame.
So those old modes of education, which emphasize that inward reflective journey, are being supplanted, it would seem. Is there a way to recapture that kind of reflective, inward-looking education? Is it? I mean, would a change in the social fabric push that along institutionally in schools, or is it something that would need to come from schools? I mean, where does the change begin?
That is very interesting. That's a great question. I would say, and building off of what Erica said, yeah, the problem is, students are sort of looking outward. Instead, yeah, it is very interesting. Instead of and you actually unlocked the memory. Actually, I remember being in a group chat and the student saying, "Oh wow, you're heterosexual. How boring." Like how sort of like how bland of you almost. And when you're in this culture where your value isn't dictated, is no longer dictated by maybe like an unmoved mover. Yeah, I truly think that previous generations operated under this idea that because your value came from God, which is like this unmoved mover, and you're God's children, you have inherent value no matter what anybody else says. But now we live in this culture where your value is determined by the amount of likes you get on Instagram, all right, about the amount of I would say cultural appreciation you get. And where does that cultural appreciation come from? It comes from not being bland. And how do you not be bland? Well, how about you join us and be a part of the spectrum? Or how about you become an ambassador for woke ideas? And so to bring this back to Brian's question, we need to shift the culture from this outward looking, oh, like I need to maintain my values, so I need to get cultural acceptance. I need people to congratulate me for different things. We need to start to tell students again. We need to start telling them again that no matter what other people think, you yourself you have inherent value, and you should be trying to every single day turn that raw potential, that limitless value, into something that you and you alone would you and you alone would appreciate, because it doesn't matter what your friends are telling you. Oh, you're so bland. That doesn't matter. I think it's cool. I think it's fine that I'm straight. It's okay. And so I would say that's the first step. That's the first step.
There's this old saying that used to be, we used to say it, called finding your voice. So when a student finds their voice, they have something authentic. It doesn't mean it's like entirely new, and but it's original in the sense that it's their thought. It's very clear when you hear a student speak from that place, as opposed to something which is just either trying to please or just something they heard somewhere and are repeating it. And I think we need to find ways, to sort of reanimate that sense, because right now finding your voice means finding your voice as a member of X group in solidarity with that political aim. It doesn't mean what it used to mean, and I think it can mean again.
Yeah, and I was going to add, just in the book Live Not by Lies, Rod Durr talks about one of the preconditions for sort of the authoritarian, totalitarian mindset to take hold is loneliness. And, I think that, what I would like to see in terms of a path forward is the schools, in terms of what they can do, just doing more in-person things, recreating that community, that school spirit I think a lot of us, grew up with, that seems again to have kind of fallen away. And I think it's, going to sound old fuddy-duddy, but getting off the screens and, connecting, in person, because then I think the kids, see each other as a real person, not all these other things. And then, having boys, in some ways, there's aspects that are easier in the sense that they're into sports. And so they do have this like community where they're just, kind of doing that, and they connect on that level, which I think is, very healthy. So I would say, trying to create these in-person communities are supportive and real, in addition to, bolstering up, your family values, heritage about your own family too. I think connecting to that history, if you're not, from a near-term immigrant family, but, a lot of us have histories of grandparents and great-grandparents that came over. And I think all those things can be helpful to, contextualize, some of these values.
So I'm going to weave in a question from the Q&A. I want to be mindful of the time here, since we have a hard stop 9:30. And there's a really brilliant question at the end of the Q&A right now that I think refines in and ties in to what we've just been talking about, and I guess in some ways doubles down on the question that's on the table about what to do. But this raises a really interesting point. And this person wrote, I think students think that they are questioning authority when they go against what is perceived as the quote unquote dominant culture, white, patriarchal, cis, heteronormativity, etc. But they don't realize that they are going along with this new cultural / moral authority that Erica Komisar spoke about. How do we get kids to truly think for themselves when they can pretend that they are doing so by conforming to this new set of norms? That is a very interesting question. I'd love to submit that to you all here.
It's also really complicated because, you know, adolescents want to be in groups. They want to be accepted by their peers. They need to be accepted by their peers. To separate from their parents, they have to have a peer group that they're accepted by. And I think, you know, that complicates it all, doesn't it? Because, you know, to be an individual, you have to find other people who have an individual voice. And you can all, I mean, you know, that's what we did in my day, right? In high school, you had to find, or college, you had to find other individuals who had a somewhat similar individual voice or not, who weren't part of the group to form another group. I mean, so right now it's complicated because I think if you go to school and the pervasive culture is that of you have to believe what we believe, then, you know, it almost becomes like a group psychosis. I hate to call it that because it's not quite, it's a little extreme, but it kind of does become that because it's very hard for adolescents to pull away from that group culture.
That's a great
Actually,
question.
yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, you know, I think the way to accomplish this is difficult. It is not something that you can, if there was a way to do it by stealth, that would be great. And I think there might be micro strategies to do that. But I think what happens in what they call Identity 101 at Grace Church, which was my school, is that in 9th grade in community diversity class, they really inculcate this socially imposed racialized identity as being the paramount identity. So, and they do that by essentially telling stories, and there's a kind of emotional coercion that goes on, whereby no matter whatever the student came in, whatever identity they had previously, which is really correct me if I'm wrong, but a negotiation with the world, what works for them, sort of a coping strategy. It is supplanted and superseded by, you know, if you're seen as a white person, well, then you are a white person, and it really is a premise of critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, that racial ignorance is a mask of this thing which is hidden, and you know, to these practitioners, these facilitators, they're eliciting something that they believe is there, even when it may not be. And they have studies that say that, you know, children are racialized by the age of 6 months. They notice things, and what I think really needs to happen there is for the individuals, and adults need to set this example, to challenge that right at the moment of instantiation and say, well, is it true if I am seen this way by you or by society? Is it incumbent upon me to cleave to that, to adopt that myself? Like, why must I adopt the way that I am seen? And if there's a way to set examples of that kind of rebellion, that kind of resistance, I think that could be really empowering, and I think that could really create a chain reaction. That's my best answer to the question. I don't know if it'll work, but.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that, Paul and Erica. Also, I think, and actually, I think also, Carrie, you mentioned the Rod Dreher book. The idea that the kids need to sort of, I think if I understood the question correctly, sort of fly under the radar while still questioning. I guess what I would like to see, and what I started to see as I resigned from my school, was that what had previously been sort of a whispering campaign, things that people would really only talk about with their most close, trusted friends, became a little bit more acceptable to talk about in a little bit of a wider circle. A few years ago at my school, there were a group of students, just a number of students, and they were like a range of political beliefs, but they didn't really like what the school was doing, and they formed something called the DEPD, the DE discussion, political discussion club, and it was considered a safe space to say anything. And that was very empowering for these kids to connect. They really didn't share much in common other than the fact that they didn't want to be told who they were or what they could or couldn't say. And it took a teacher who was willing to, be a club advisor, and that club is still, as far as I know, is still going pretty strong. And I don't think they actually even really talk about politics, though. As far as I know, I think they just kind of hang out and connect. So I guess I would encourage, I know it's really, really very difficult, but to make connections, for teenagers to make connections with other kids, Daniel, in the way that you were describing, the kids who, even if they're just whispering, to sort of take baby steps towards, maybe louder whispering.
No, yeah, I was definitely going to say something similar. I would say that it's very interesting. That question is very interesting because it's sort of like, how do you show students that this what they're being told as or what they're being taught is that authority to be overthrown. And I think that there are a plurality, if not a majority, of students who have questions about what they're learning, especially students who are around my graduating class. I would say that the way we've been taught has it changed, right? We haven't been taught these topics. I haven't been taught these topics elementary school, middle school, and I would say, for the beginning of high school, everything rapidly changed in the last 2-3 years. I actually had to have the experience of reading the narrative of Frederick Douglass once in middle school and once in high school, and being able to see the differences between the way I was taught it in middle school and charter school and the way I've been taught it, or the way I was taught it now. So a lot of students, I would say, they know something is up, and if you are able to A, point their attention to it, and then B, group them together and like help them group together so they can combat the authoritarian thinking as one body, then that would be I think that's the solution. What do I mean by pointing it out? And so I would do this sometimes in class. I would say, hey, like, what do you think about this? Like, does that sound right to you? And I'll whisper to maybe a student next to me, and they would give an honest answer, like, hey, yeah, that doesn't sound right to me. And then you say, right, like, that's sort of weird. And like, they don't necessarily know, like, the I would say the ideological, like, underpinnings of whatever they're being taught. But if you come to them in a relatable way, just like, that doesn't sound right to me. A lot of students would say, yeah, it doesn't. I was thinking that as well, but I didn't want to say anything. And so there are a lot of students like that. And so that's what, when we get to point B, we need to somehow group them, because what is going on right now is, I think, there is a small amount of students who are the most ideological, and they moved together like a machine, right? And so if one student says something wrong on social media, one ideological student will repost on his story, look what he said, oh my God. And then quickly after, all the other ideological allies would then repost that on your story and say, look at what he's doing. Oh, like, and they'll, like, name call whatever the name of the day is, whether it's racist, sexist, anti-masker, whatever. And so what the opposition, what our team need to do is, I would say, move as a machine as well. All the students are dispersed. They all have, questions, comments, concerns about this. But here's what's going on. They're not coming to me together. Like, well, after I wrote the piece, are not coming together in droves in groups saying, "Hey Daniel, I read your piece." They're coming in singles and they're whispering, "Hey Daniel, I seen your piece. That's I agree with you. That's pretty good. Hey Daniel, I may not agree with your political beliefs, but you know, I do agree with the premise about, you know, how like I don't want to be virtue signaling and whatnot." And so if we were able to group those students together and have them, you know, work together, I think that is the first step to combating what's going on right now.
I think it also takes really brave educators and administrators of schools. It takes leaders who are adults to kind of not go with the flow of this kind of fearful mob culture. You know, it's what it's created, you know, but to actually stand up to it. And that's a hard thing for me to say, because I'm not in a school where I could get fired, or the board could fire me, or the principal could say, you know, you're not part of our culture. But, you know, I mean, that's what it would take. It would take re-educating educators to, you know, to allow free thinking again. And also just, it would take a handful of educators in each school, you know, to stand up to the culture and say, because even what you're talking about, Daniel, you know, that also requires mentoring from adults too, from teachers and administrators, to say, you know, it's okay to express other opinions. It's okay to have your own, to speak your own mind. And there has to be a forum for that.
I just wanted to, that's great. And I wanted to say that what Daniel said about, does that seem right to you? Does that seem right to you? Is an incredibly subversive way of asking that question. The phrasing, does it seem right? Not does it seem right in, you know, what we all think, but it puts the onus on the person, and it kind of pierces that veil of what I'm supposed to say, and like, oh, does it seem right to me? Well, yeah, not really. You know, I think that's a wonderful way to do that.
Yeah, I've
Yeah,
seen. Oh, sorry, Dana. You want to go?
Yeah, just quickly, yeah, I've heard students say, this just doesn't sit right with me. And I just love that formulation. It asserts that independence and that autonomy. Go ahead, Gavin, sorry about that.
Oh, I was gonna say, I agree. I have seen like a few teachers in my time sort of neutralize this classroom environment. By college, it's a little hard, I think, because the kids already think they know everything, and they can sort of like, you know, side at each other when like a professor's talking. But in high school and middle school, I think even now, even though it's gotten worse, it is possible. I think it's like, in a way, it's like making being yourself cool again. Like, I think like, you know, maybe like, I mean, I wasn't alive back then, but I think in like the 80s, it was hard to sort of fake who you are, because the sort of requirements for being cool were maybe like, are you a jock? Are you this type of kid? But now it's like, being yourself, you can totally make people think you're this political person when you're not, this, you know, sort of group thinking type person. And I have seen, you know, I mean, it's the same reason, in my opinion, why, you know, I think as a teacher, you could explain to a student, like, you know, stuff like, you only argue with someone you respect, you know, like you would only yell at the kid you don't agree with, and, you know, who's maybe a contrarian, because you actually think he can handle it. Whereas, like, you know, a lot of students will sit there and nod at each other, but they actually on some level don't think they can handle each other's words. So I think in a way, sort of making it, I guess, cool again to like speak your mind, you know, I think that's like maybe a way to sort of get through this.
You know, I was going to add just along this lines is just really having an outlet, you know, to talk about things. I think that's to some degree what we're talking about. And I know, obviously, you know, FAIR has been a great outlet for the adults trying to figure out how to navigate through all this, because it sort of is just kind of bubbled up in a very intense way in different aspects, you know, of our lives. And I know, you know, they're looking at having student clubs in schools, which would be tremendous as an outlet to start this. But I think it's a great opportunity to, you know, plug more of all the resources FAIR has developed just in a short 6-7 months, where, you know, there's a FAIR transparency where you can, you know, report things good or bad that are kind of working in either your school or workplace environment, fair in medicine, the general chapters. So I think, for me, the part of the path forward in kind of bolstering up the mental health kind of and keeping it strong is having healthy outlets. And I think that's where FAIR has done, a tremendous job. I can speak for myself. I feel a lot more optimistic knowing that there is a path forward with folks working and trying to figure this out.
I'm going to jump in here. I just want to draw us back to the Q&A for a moment. I think certainly, the resources that are out there to draw folks out of the shadows. I do think it's true that, as Daniel pointed out, it's a small but very organized, very machine-like group of people that can overtake the culture of an institution. I think we're seeing that. And it's strange to say, I think, that people with these kinds of pro-human values are actually in the majority, but are facing the entrenchment of something very different. The resources that can draw folks out of the shadows obviously are critical to this, but we've focused somewhat disproportionately on the school ecosystem. But at points in the evening, we've talked a little bit about the role of the home and parents and other things. And there's another, there's a question in the Q&A that certainly draws us back to another input that we're seeing more and more of in our world, which is the mental health professionals. And I think in a way, this is a question more for Erica and Carrie, perhaps, though I think we could all wade in some way. And this person asks, adolescents often require counseling. How badly compromised are mental health professionals by some of these ideologies? Should we be concerned that those professionals can harm our kids? And how can we know if patient confidentiality is shielding the adult, another important input here, from the details? So I'd love to put that out there, I think first really to Erica, but then we can open it up.
Ooh, that's a big question. Well, as mental health professionals, we're supposed to remain objective. And that doesn't mean everybody's good, and it doesn't mean everybody's objective. But if you're well trained and you've had a lot of, I always encourage people when they're getting help for themselves or for their children to make sure that the person that is treating your child has had a lot of treatment themselves. And most people don't know that, and they don't know that they can ask that. And you can ask that. As a psychoanalyst, as part of our training, we have to be in treatment for a long time, a really long time. And most people don't know that many psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, just because they have certification next to their name doesn't mean that they've had good postgraduate training, and it doesn't mean they've ever been in any kind of treatment themselves. So we are supposed to be objective. We are not supposed to bring ourselves into it. And in terms of confidentiality, it's a little complicated in that young children do not have the privilege of confidentiality, because parent guidance work is a very important part of mental health treatment for children. When it comes to adolescents, it gets trickier, because adolescents actually do need more confidentiality. They need more privacy. Otherwise, they won't trust their therapist. But there are certain outs with that. There are certain caveats. If an adolescent is a risk to himself or a risk to others, therapists break down those boundaries and they tell them from the beginning. But it's a very complicated question you're asking.
Yeah, and I would only add, my view is when I'm in the emergency department and patients are coming in because they are suicidal and have been referred for that reason. And I've found the mental health professionals evaluating them, very appropriate. I haven't seen anything unusual. I've just heard anecdotally from friends who are teachers in schools that there is more what seems to be stretching on things like, they've heard, you're not supposed to tell parents if a student is, questioning their gender, like trying to hide things from parents. I think I've heard about that happening in schools, but those are just anecdotal stories. I personally have not encountered anything like that in the emergency department. I would just say, you know, like anything, is just ask questions, you know, to the therapist, like Erica was suggesting, and have more of these discriminating type questions because of this environment. I think we just have to probe more.
And ask for parent guidance. That's the term. So when your child is in treatment, you should ask for parent guidance sessions, because it's a therapist's responsibility to help parents understand their child, be empathic towards their child. But also those parent guidance sessions are to ease a parent's anxiety. I mean, it's so important that parents are also, that their concerns are addressed. And so, yeah, if your child is in treatment, ask for parent guidance along with those sessions. And it's not with the child, it's separately, it's something for you.
So we've got time for, I think, one more question from the Q&A, but I just want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists tonight for being here and for thinking out loud and sharing their insight, their unique vantage point with us all. The goal of any such webinar is to get us thinking and to give us some food for thought that hopefully we'll carry with us, and maybe on the commute to work the next day, and over the course of the next few weeks, we'll continue talking and reading about these things. And I encourage you all again to visit fairforall.org. Almost all of the people here have posted things and have written in ways that FAIR has drawn attention to and published. And we'd love to hear from you, feedback both about this webinar and also just about these questions. There's a lot to think about here. Cracking this code is certainly complicated. And we hope that this evening's discussion was a step in that direction. There's a really interesting question at the end of the Q&A, and I think I'd love to bring this up and just get, I think we have time for kind of a quick response, which is not sufficient to answer a rich question like this, but it's a great thing to put in our minds to leave it with, and it's a complicated question. But they say, it seems like victimhood is a commodity. People gain attention now for professing their vulnerability and their perceived victimhood. How do we get youth to understand the difference between a true mental health problem versus just typical stress and adversity?
Well, I mean, can I quickly answer that? Everybody has a stressful day. Everybody has an anxious moment. Everybody has a depressed moment. In fact, that's part of life. The thing that differentiates anxiety and depression from just having a depressed or anxious moment is what we call intensity and chronicity. If your symptoms last for more than 2 weeks, and if they're really intense. So I wrote a book, you can buy it or get it in the library, and it has a list of everything you should look for, all the symptoms and signs to identify in your child. So it's a book for parents or educators or social workers, a list of symptoms to look for. The symptoms alone aren't enough. You have to really understand how intense those symptoms have been, how many of them there have been, and how long that child has been experiencing them.
All right, well, thank you. And now we know we have a resource we can go to. Any other final thoughts? Okay, well, again, thank you all so much. And thank you, audience, for joining us and sticking with us. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you'll follow up with us and keep apprised of our webinars and all the work that we're doing here at FAIR. And we hope you found this evening truly informative. I know I did. So thank you all so much, and good evening.